What's up, Yinzers, Yinzettes? Welcome to the final episode of season one of Pucks and Nat. Yes, final episode of season one of Pucks and Nat, where we brought you the latest downtime breakdowns all season long, as well as everything from the past week in Penguins hockey. And in this case, it's going to be from the past year in Penguins hockey. So, um, I'm not going to try to keep you as long as I have been keeping you recently. But just to give a little bit of a rundown of what we're going to be talking about in today's show, we're just going to talk about this final week for the Penguins, as well as just how the locker cleanout day went and some of the little nuggets that may have been pulled from there. I'm also going to do trending up, trending down this week, but it's going to be a season edition. We're going to talk about players for two each who, have had a good season and some guys who may have fallen off a little bit. We're going to talk about revisiting the Jake Guentzel trade, which I think it's kind of safe to do that at this point. And yeah, we're gonna have some fun with this one. So once again, just as a reminder, I'm Kelsey Sermetz of the Hockey News. I'm your host for Pucks and Nat. You can find me on X at Kelsey underscore Sermetz 4, and you can find me on Blue Sky. Same thing without the underscore. And please read and follow along with all my stuff on the Hockey News Penguins website. I am the site editor as well as the team reporter for the Hockey News. So, first of all, as I said, it's the end of season one. It is crazy that we've already reached this point, but thank you guys for following along. I know there's been a lot of trials and tribulations this year. As you know, I started off the year with a co-host, Hannah Kerkel, and she has solidified a role with Vegas Hockey now. She is happily covering the playoffs over in Vegas for the Golden Knights right now. So kudos to her. Just awesome stuff that she's working on. You should check everything out that she's doing. Doing some awesome work with Vegas, but I am running this solo. I still do not have my soundboard. I will look to retrieve that eventually so we can have our sound effects back, so we can have our intro music back. But as I kind of navigate this transition, again, I realize this is a Wednesday. I'm filming this Saturday night, but this is going to be Sunday morning when this comes out. And for American listeners, it's Easter Sunday for some people. Happy Easter to all who celebrate. But, bear with me here. I apologize. I'm kind of navigating some of these changes too. And just with, the past couple of weeks, it's been a little bit crazy with the end of the season. So I think my resolution for season two will definitely make this more consistent. I love to have a lot more guests on, hopefully another permanent co-host. But honestly, give me all the feedback you have, guys. Leave it in the YouTube comments. Let us know on social media. Leave it on, I think Spotify has a comment section. You can talk about it there. I do want to make this as interactive as possible. And I just kind of want to, give a personal anecdote for a second too, because I genuinely do enjoy, interaction with fans, and Penguins fans too. I mean, it's a passionate fan base. And I think there, for a long time, was kind of a disconnect between media and fans. And obviously there's, some reasons it is that way, but I am honestly an open book. I look forward to conversations with you guys. So if you have any suggestions for the show or just, want to talk some hockey, you can always shoot me a message. You can always, respond to one of my tweets. You can respond to this video. I'd love to make this as interactive as possible, so please give me as much feedback as possible. But I will try to make this more consistent next season, and we're gonna have a little bit more build out. But just back to the personal anecdote for a second. This was my first year covering the Penguins for the Hockey News, and it is crazy that it's already over. I mean, it went so fast. And, I do want to speak on this for a second because I do think, this can be kind of an intimidating line of work for a lot of people. And, honestly, it is. I mean, just personally, I remember when, I was growing up, I knew exactly what I wanted to be when I was older. you know, I went into high school. I was, I made the journalism class my freshman year. I was sports editor by sophomore year. I was editor in chief, by my senior year. And so I always knew that this was something I wanted to get into. So I attended Ohio University, went to college for journalism. And I'm going to be honest with you. I covered, the Bobcats hockey team. They were a club team, but a good one, in the ACHA for my freshman and sophomore year. And at the time, this was 2013, so we're talking about over a decade ago. Um, you know, there was still a lot of work to be done with women in this field. Um, and I still think there is a lot of work to be done. But it was even a lot different a decade ago than it is now. And I'm going to be honest with you guys, I was scared out of it. Um, there were just a lot of things, a series of events that happened that caused me to kind of walk away from this for a little bit. I changed my major, thought it was the right move at the time. I did have a journalism teacher, Justice Hill. Shout out if you're listening. I doubt it, but I do want you to know that this conversation mattered. He had a long conversation with me and just said, "Hey, I think you're making a mistake by switching your major." When you're, a 19-year-old kid trying to find your way in the world, that you don't want to hear that. So, I went about my way. I changed my major, and a couple years after I graduated with a bachelor's in communication studies, I missed this a lot. um, and I realized Justice Hill was right, you know? And from there, I mean, I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but basically, I started being active on socials again, just with in the sports media space. I made some connections on the Pittsburgh sports media scene. I had a mentorship program with the PHWA, which big shout out to Rob Rossi for that one. He was my mentor, and we connected that way. And then it kind of got me this gig. So, guys, I guess the antidote I'm trying to really sell here, and especially to any women who might be listening, is it does seem really big at times to try to make the jump into this field, and it is very difficult, but don't give up on it. I mean, if you have an aspiration, even if it's not for this, do what you can to make connections. I learned that for me personally, just staying active on social media was a big thing. Um, so don't give up on it. It's worth it. It's worth it. It took me a long time to kind of get where I wanted to be, but I couldn't be happier than than I am now. Just in this line of work, it's where I always wanted to be. And, I can't complain too much about the kind of work I'm doing. So, um, you know, keep at it. Don't give up. It's going to be hard. There's going to be a lot of bumps in the road. There still are a lot of bumps in the road for me, but it's all learning experience, and you can take something from every experience is kind of what I've learned. So, anyway, little antidote out of the way. So let's jump into Penguins hockey. Enough about me, enough about the year. But thanks for following along with me all year as well, and following along with the DHN coverage. I will continue to have coverage throughout the off season, but we'll get to that. We'll wrap back around to that at the end of the show. So I do want to talk a little bit about, the Penguins' final week, because it was a pretty good close to the season for the Penguins. I mean, if you're looking at things from an objective win-loss standpoint, in their last 6 games, they did go 4-2. And, 4 of those teams were playoff teams. So, well, they lost to the Bruins, but, you know, pretty good week or a pretty good last 6 games. And, you can argue the merits of whether or not that was the best thing for the Penguins. But at the end of the day, they gave their young guys a shot, which was a big boost. and their goaltending kind of hunkered down a little bit. So it is what it is. I wouldn't lose sleep over getting, they're in the 9th overall position as of now for the draft. Don't lose sleep over them picking 9th potentially instead of 7th, because that's probably around the range of what the best outcome would have been. So, but anyway, so since we last met, the Penguins have played the Devils, the Bruins, and the Washington Capitals to close out their season. So they did beat the Devils in pretty convincing fashion last Friday. And then they had a 4-1 loss to the Bruins on Sunday. But I do kind of want to talk about this Capitals game because, they had a couple of days off. They played the Capitals on Thursday, and it was a really good effort from top to bottom from the Penguins. It was a 5-2 win. And I got to say, and I'm sure all of you listeners agree, it never gets old. Never gets old watching Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin take the ice against one another. And we know Ovechkin's not retiring this season. There have been kind of some hints that he might retire after next season, as his contract expires. But this was kind of a vintage. We saw a few vintage moments, in this game that really reminded us that we're witnessing 2 all-time great players take the ice, and we don't know how many more times we're going to get to see this. And if Ovechkin does retire at the end of next season, I mean, there's only a couple more times. So enjoy it, folks. But we did see, if you were at the game, you saw that there was a nice tribute to Ovechkin during the first commercial break. They kind of played a little video tribute on the board for him breaking Wayne Gretzky's goal record. Really, really awesome ovation from the Pittsburgh crowd. There were a lot of Washington fans there too, but awesome ovation from the Pittsburgh crowd, from the Penguins bench. Ovi did kind of a little lap in the neutral zone and waved to the crowd. So it was a really nice moment. So good job, Pittsburgh. Really awesome moment and really good way to honor a record that may never be broken again. We'll see. But just incredible stuff. But yeah, so we saw a few different career milestones in this game and career highs. So Brian Rust did hit that 30 goal mark in the first period. Penguins were down 1-0 early on a Connor McMichael goal. But Brian Rust, registered his 30th before the end of the first period. Primary assist by Ville Koivunen, which we'll get to him a little bit more later. But Koivunen on that point did extend his point streak to 5 games. So good stuff from him there. Matt Grzelcyk also picked up a secondary assist on that one. And then in the second period, Rust struck again for his 31st of the season on the power play, which Penguins power play ended up 6th in the league this season. You can talk about all the failures from this season, but man, is the power play a success story. David Quinn really unlocked something there. I think the Penguins figured out that a way to split their units to make to get the most out of the personnel on those units. And Matt Grzelcyk's been a big part of that too. At least that unit with Crosby, Rust, Raquel, and whoever has been rotating recently has been Koivunen. But Brian Rust does pick up that power play goal. That's his 31st. Koivunen picked up another point on that with a secondary. And then the primary assist went to Sidney Crosby. And that gave him his 90th point of the season, which means that he is the only player over the age of 35 to record at least 3 90-point seasons. Just remarkable. I mean, we've talked about Sid how many times on this show, but it's unbelievable to see what he's still doing at age 37. And I'm going to talk about that more later because I think this will lend to another point, something that was kind of discussed on Locker Cleanout Day that might relate and we've discussed it before, so we'll get back to that. But yeah, Sidney Crosby picks up the primary assist on that one for his 90th point. And then a few minutes later, Crosby gets a goal of his own. And this is where those vintage moments that I was talking about came in, because Crosby took a nice feed from Philip Tomasino, who played a really nice game, by the way. Just a side note, you could tell that, Tomasino's a pending restricted free agent. This guy was playing for a contract in this game, and you could really tell. He was everywhere in a good way on Thursday, and, he was making things happen. We saw his creativity on display in the offensive zone, as we've seen at times this season. This was a nice little feed to Crosby. He was in the slot, and he kind of in the low slot area, and he kind of faked out the defender, fed it to Crosby, who was waiting in his office at the bottom of the right circle, got down to one knee, and the rest was history. Absolute rocket of a shot, too. Rocket of a one-timer. So, but anyway, great game by Tomasino. Crosby picks up his 91st point, his 33rd goal of the season. And then 5 minutes later, we trade iconic moments because, Washington gets a power play and Alex Ovechkin scores a signature goal on a one-timer from the left circle on the power play, as we've seen so many times. He was left wide open by the Penguins penalty kill, which at that point was a makeshift unit because pretty much all the regular penalty killers were injured and done for the season. So kind of seeing Crosby and Ovechkin trade those signature moments in that game really just reinforce this idea that you just got to enjoy what you're watching out of these two. I'm not sure you're ever going to see anything like this again, with just the way that their careers have mirrored each other for 2 decades. And Ovechkin has alluded to this. Even Crosby alluded to this. They're very well aware that the two of them pretty much saved the league. And Brian Russ said something similar after the game, too. He said he was geeked out. The hockey geek in him was going crazy just in this game because, from his perspective, he said those two guys saved the game. The league wasn't in a good place. And these two young bucks, he said, came in and took the league by storm and ended up saving the league. I don't think that's an understatement. You think about where this league was financially coming out of the lockout. It wasn't in a great place at all. And then you have this young Russian sniper and this young Canadian phenom, the next Wayne Gretzky, come into the league in the same exact year. Both have unbelievable rookie campaigns. Ovechkin got the Calder that season, but Crosby had 102 points. These guys didn't waste any time. I mean, this was immediate, and you just don't see that from players, even the great ones. Even the great ones usually take a little bit of time, a few seasons to find their footing, but that didn't happen with these guys. And that was the best possible thing that could have happened to hockey. And so to say that they saved the league, no, that's not an exaggeration. These guys saved the league. And what a ride it has been for 20 years. Enjoy every moment of it. Tune into every game next season. It could very well be the last season that we're watching these two on the ice at the same time. Just remarkable careers for both of them. And for both of them to go out and break Gretzky records in the same season as well. Just unbelievable how much their careers have mirrored each other. And they're both just completely defying father time because, I was mentioned how Crosby had ended the season with 91 points. Again, remarkable. But let's talk about how Ovechkin ended the season with, 73 points, 44 goals in just 65 games. Just no words. They're just unbelievable, both of them. Appreciate both of them. And, We'll see how much time each of them have left in them. They're not slowing down, folks. They're not slowing down. And that is good for hockey. Still good for hockey. And in my book, they're still the two faces of the league. And I think everybody realized that this season with the great chase. But anyway, so really good to cool to see that be the last matchup of the season. And we'll get to this a little bit later too, but it was also quite fitting because, as everyone knows at this point, the Penguins and the Capitals are on different courses right now. The Capitals were the best team in the East this season. They played the Montreal Canadiens in round one, who occupied the second wildcard spot, secured that. And obviously, the Penguins are in a transitional period. I think they're, as I said earlier, I'm going to talk about this later, but I think they are going to try to execute something akin to the Capitals. It doesn't always happen the same way, but they have some pieces in place. So we'll get to that a little bit later, but awesome to see Pens Caps as the last regular season game. But I do want to talk a little bit more about Ville Koivunen, because just in case you haven't caught up or you've been living under a rock, Rucker McGroarty was unfortunately injured and was unable to complete the season. So it was just Koivunen for those, last few games there. And man, this guy is impressive. I know we've talked about this the past couple weeks on the podcast, but he had 7 points in 8 games. 7 points in his first 8 NHL games. The last time that happened? That was 2017 when Jake Guentzel had 7 points in 8 games. Now, granted, Koivunen didn't score any goals. It wasn't for a lack of trying. It wasn't for a lack of ability. A lot of it was just puck luck. Even in that game against Washington, he had a 2-on-1 with I think it was Crosby. Crosby feeds him a perfect pass on a dish, on a platter, and Koivunen hits the post. Then later on, Koivunen did think he scored his first NHL goal, kind of crashed into the net, but he swatted the puck in with his hand. He said he knew it wasn't going to count right away. So the goal was disallowed. It was taken back. Kind of unfortunate. Brian Rust said later that he didn't agree with it. I'm not sure I agree with Brian Rust, but and I don't think Ville agreed with Brian Rust either, but you take it, I guess. So, but anyway, I don't think it matters that he didn't score a goal at all because, Koivunen has shown to be a finisher at the AHL level this season. He was top 3 in goals among rookies at the time of his call-up. But he impresses me so much with his hockey sense. And he's just always in the right place at the right time. He's making the right plays. Some of his passes are ridiculous. You can see the playmaking instinct in him. And, I think it's time we really revisit this Jake Guentzel trade. Because, I know, let's get one thing straight. Jake Guentzel is one of the elite wingers in the National Hockey League. I mean, you can talk about there was that stupid narrative for how many years about him being a product of Sidney Crosby, yada, 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 yada. Well, guess what? I think he disproved that this season when he went down to Tampa Bay and did the same exact things that he was doing with Sidney Crosby in Pittsburgh. Now, he had Nikita Kucherov down there, but, it doesn't matter. Jake Guentzel's a great hockey player. Let's not get that twisted. I mean, just for reference, last season, before being traded to Carolina, Guentzel had 22 goals and 52 points in 50 games with Pittsburgh. He had 8 goals and 25 points in 17 games with Carolina. And then this season with the Tampa Bay Lightning, 41 goals and 80 points in 80 games. Guys, he's a good hockey player. And normally, I see some of this sentiment on social media that the Penguins should have gotten a sure-handed first-round pick for Guentzel. But I kind of want to revisit this situation because obviously hindsight's 2020. This very well could not have worked out for the Penguins, right? But I think something to consider here is, first of all, let's remember that this was a conditional first round pick. Now, granted, it wasn't a sure-handed first round pick, but it was a conditional first round pick. And at the time when Guentzel was traded to Carolina, there were a lot of people picking Carolina to go to the Stanley Cup final. A lot of analysts, a lot of GMs. They have that anonymous poll from The Athletic, every year. And a lot of GMs picked Carolina. I think Dubas might have been included here, that people just thought that Carolina was going to make it. They had a really good team last year. Maybe Dubas took that bet too. Anyway, he got the conditional first for Guentzel, and that ended up turning into Harrison Brunick, which that's basically a first-round talent anyway. There were a lot of people that believed that Brunick would have been drafted in the first round if not for his injury in his draft season. So essentially the Penguins ended up recouping first round value out of that pick anyway, because they got Harrison Brunick as a result. But let's look at this trade as a whole. So people talk about that first round pick as if it was supposed to be the main piece of this trade. Ville Koivunen all along was the main piece of this trade. And he was rated the top prospect dealt at the trade deadline last season for good reason. And you look at this trade, so Guentzel goes to Carolina, Penguins get Michael Bunting, they get Ville Koivunen, they get Vasily Ponomarev, Cruz Lucius, and that conditional first round pick that turned into a second rounder that turned into Harrison Brunick. And then obviously this season, the Penguins trade Michael Bunting to the Nashville Predators for Luke Schenn, Tommy Novak. And then they flip Schenn to the Winnipeg Jets for a second round pick. So that Guentzel trade tree, if you're looking at it from the scope of everything, they got Koivunen, Ponomarev, Lucius, Brunick, Novak, and a second round pick. That's not bad for a rental. For a pending unrestricted free agent rental who didn't even end up signing with the club that he was traded to, that's looking pretty good. And you think about Koivunen and you think about Brunick and the ceilings that these guys could have. I mean, Koivunen has top line potential. We saw, and granted it's a small sample size in 8 games, but this guy has point per game potential. And that's Guentzel level stuff in terms of point per game. He might not be the goal scorer that Guentzel is and was, but if Koivunen's on a top line, producing at point per game, because let's go ceilings here. Because let's face it, Jake Guentzel was a third round pick. He was never supposed to become what he is. But Koivunen, originally a second round pick, if he can be a top line player and be at point per game or around point per game, if Harrison Brunick, who I would argue is the Penguins' top prospect, he struggled a little bit for the first few games at the AHL level once his junior season was over this season, but past few games, he's looking like he did in Penguins training camp back in September. And if you watched him in training camp back in September, you know what I'm talking about. This guy's legit. And I don't think the Penguins have had a more exciting defensive prospect in their system, maybe since Letang. Arguably, I think there's some ways that he kind of looks like he has an even higher ceiling than Letang. That's obviously a very, 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 very big stretch at this point, but I think there's some signs there. Even if just Koivunen and Brunick hit their peak potential at the AHL level, which again for Koivunen is a top line player at point per game, and Brunick is a top pairing defenseman, a top pairing two-way play driving defenseman, which he very well seems he could evolve into at the NHL level. Trading a pending unrestricted free agent rental winger, an elite one, yes, but for two guys who are going to figure to be a huge part of your future and very productive NHL players, potentially near the top of the class in the league at their respective positions. That's not bad. That's not a bad outcome for the Penguins. And that's not even speaking to, the fact that Tommy Novak has potential to be a pretty good third line center. That's not speaking to the fact that Vasily Ponomarev has a ceiling as a third line center, is probably more realistically an ideal fourth line center. And Cruz Lucius, a little bit of a wild card. I'm not entirely convinced that he can be an impact player at the NHL level, but he did have two really solid seasons at the University of Wisconsin, before transferring to Arizona State University this season. A little bit of a down year. There were some injury issues as well, but, this is looking more and more and more like a really, really solid trade for the Penguins. And, we've seen guys come up and show something in a short sample at the NHL level, then fade out. I'm not getting that impression from Koivunen. Koivunen looks like the real deal, and it's because of his process. It's because of the way he thinks the game. It's because of his vision, his playmaking smarts, his creativity. Those are things that you simply can't teach, that he already has, and it lends to his productivity. So I don't think this is a case of a guy that you're seeing just, go on a hot streak with production and it's going to flame out. This looks sustainable. And maybe I come back to this 2 years from now and I'm dead wrong, but I feel pretty confident in saying that Ville Koivunen is going to be an impact NHL player. I feel pretty confident in saying that Harrison Brunick is going to be an impact NHL player. If they can get a top defenseman and a top line winger for a pending UFA rental, who's an elite winger, yes, but also about 30 years old, sign me up. We'll see what happens, but I'm really liking the early returns on the Guentzel trade, and we'll see how the other pieces play out too, because like I said, I'm excited to see more of Novak next season, more of Ponomarev, just kind of what they can bring. Jury's out on that. But Guentzel trade, right now it's a win for me. So I do want to kind of move on to the next segment. We are past the 30-minute mark. Like I said, I don't want to keep you forever today. And I want to do trending up, trending down, because I haven't done that in a couple weeks. I know Hannah was on the show a couple weeks ago, and we did it then for old time's sake. And I don't have the sound effects. So sorry. Wish I did. If I would have thought of it, I would have pulled something up on YouTube. Played it into the microphone. I mean, I guess I could still do that. Is there like a children cheering sound or something? Let's see here. Children cheering sound effect. There it is. Children cheering sound effect. Well, anyway, I did it early. So let's do trending up first. So my trending up players of the year, I told you I was going to do two each, are Ricard Raquel and Sidney Crosby. So there it is. I don't think it's a cop-out to pick Sidney Crosby. I'll just go over his first, but Sidney Crosby, what else can you say? I mean, again, this guy is registering 90-point seasons. over the age of 35 for 3 straight years. I mean, you talk about a beacon of consistency and just a standard of dominance and greatness for 2 decades in the NHL. That's Sidney Crosby. And look, I'll get to this at the end with the locker cleanout stuff. I'm not going to spend too much time on Sid now, but he's playing like he's 27 years old. He's playing like he's 27 years old. He hasn't missed a beat. He doesn't seem to be declining. And people say, yeah, age catches up to everybody. But Brian Rust posed a pretty good question at locker cleanout day the other day. He said, does Sidney Crosby age? I'm not sure that he does. I'm not sure that he does. I mean, can we really answer that question right now? Sidney Crosby isn't just any hockey player that's, if you go back through the annals of NHL history, you're not going to find somebody else like Sidney Crosby. He's just built different. He is a different breed. And he's been able to sustain this greatness for so long for a reason. He's just not like anybody else who's ever gone through the league in that regard. And again, I'll get to that later, but that's something you should consider if you're Penguins management. When you're considering somebody to build a team around, 37-year-old Sidney Crosby is basically 27-year-old Sidney Crosby. So, there's no sign of a decline in sight. There's no sign of a dip in his game. He just keeps evolving his game to make sure he stays on top of it. It's hard to imagine a drastic fall off anytime soon. If anything, with Sid, I think when we start to inevitably one day, 100 years from now, see that decline, it's going to be a more gradual decline than a lot of other players. I don't foresee a situation, also depending on how long he plays. I just don't foresee a situation where it's just going to be him falling off a cliff. Not going to happen that way. I'll eat crow if it does, but again, just like Ville Koivunen being an impact NHL player, I'm going to bank on Sidney Crosby not falling off a cliff when he begins to age out. So anyway, Sidney Crosby, if he could be trending up, still is at age 37. He just keeps getting better. And then as far as, Rickard Rakell, what a bounce back campaign it was for Rickard Rakell, because, he did come in and have a really solid first full season with Pittsburgh. Because if you remember, he came over in the 2022 trade deadline. Probably Ron Hextall's best move as Pittsburgh Penguins GM. Not probably, definitely. But he came over at the trade deadline in 2022. And, he played pretty well in that span. 4 goals, 13 points in 19 games. I think he played a couple games on the third line, and then he moved on the line with Gino, and, kind of a little bit of getting used to everything in Pittsburgh. But that first full season was solid in 2022, 2023. He spent a fair amount of time playing with Sid that year, and he registered 28 goals, 60 points in 82 games. Pretty good, right? Well, everybody remembers last season. That seems to be kind of the narrative around Rakell, is just this inconsistency with his game. Now, Rakell himself will tell you that he wasn't happy about last season. And he, as any professional athlete does, isn't going to make excuses with him dealing with injuries last season, because, that was true. He did have an IR stint. He had a slow start, then an IR stint, and then he had an injured shoulder the rest of the season, or for a large chunk of the back half of the season. And in the back half of the season, he actually did pretty well. So, I think there were a few different factors, in last season's decline in production. And also, he didn't spend a ton of time with Sidney Crosby last year either, because obviously the Penguins still had Jake Guentzel, they had Brian Rust. That line was gelling pretty well. The only time he was really up on that line with Sid was when one of the other ones were injured or weren't playing for whatever reason. So, I mean, Raquel had a down year, kind of started this narrative of, oh my God, there's 4 years left on this guy's contract, $5 million cap hit, whatever will we do? Then he comes in and has a career season. 35 goals, new career high. 70 points, a new career high. In 81 games. Look, I'm never one. I'd never doubted Raquel. That was my kind of proudest prediction this season, was that I knew he was going to have a bounce back year, and he did. And I think something that he showed, and this is the same thing that he did in Anaheim, when Raquel is playing with an elite playmaking center, this is the player that he is. And he spent most of this season playing with Sidney Crosby. When he had those really good couple seasons in Anaheim, he was playing with Ryan Getzlaf. And don't underestimate Ryan Getzlaf's playmaking ability. He's an incredible passer, great playmaker. Raquel and Crosby are just magic together. And I know with, Ville Koivunen in the fold at the end of the season, Brian Rust is Crosby's preferred winger. They had Koivunen, Rust, and Crosby, and then they bumped Raquel down with, for a couple games as the second line center. But then after that, once Evgeny Malkin came back, it was Evgeny Malkin, him, and actually Koivunen before McGroarty got hurt. But and he wasn't as productive 5-on-5 with Malkin. That's kind of been the historical context with that. But the lesson here is Rickard Rakell is a heck of a hockey player. And I think he's still pretty good on both sides of the puck. Now, obviously, that first line had its struggles on the defensive side. They were all in the minus 20s. Not ideal. And Sid even pointed that out the other day. He's like, I don't want to be minus 22. So, but that aside, I mean, Rakell's a pretty conscientious player on both sides of the ice. He actually, second among forwards in block shots, second among forwards in hits. That was only Noel Chari. He does a lot of those thankless jobs that Mike Sullivan talks about. He isn't afraid to go to the dirty areas. He grinds. He wins puck battles. He's willing to do that kind of work to make plays. And as long as he's playing with Crosby, I just don't see a steep decline in his production. This is just who he is. And let's not forget that he's not a fossil either. I feel like there's so many people that think he's like 34 years old already. Guys, he's only 31. He's about to be 32, but he's not a fossil. He's not even as old as Brian Rust. I think there's still a couple solid years left in him. And again, if he's playing with Crosby, I don't see this production going down. And he's got 3 years left on his deal. It remains to be seen what the Penguins are going to do this summer. But, I don't think there's any hurt in keeping him around, especially if they're trying to turn this around as quick as possible. But really good comeback season from Raquel. And just a really, really impressive display of what, he's capable of. And just as a side note, Brian Rust and Rickard Raquel both scored 30 goals this season, as did Sidney Crosby. The Penguins were only one of 5 teams in the NHL to have 3 30-goal scorers on their roster. Also, this is the very first time in Sidney Crosby's playing career that both of his wingers scored 30 goals. So I would say that kind of made up for the loss of Guentzel. Now, granted, they didn't, with Guentzel in the fold, either Rust or Raquel was on the second line. There was nobody to help out Evgeny Malkin this year, that poor guy. But, as far as Sid is concerned, they filled that void just fine. So, That's my trending up. Now let's go to trending down. And by the way, my honorable mention for trending up was Matt Grzelcyk because I definitely think he exceeded expectations this year. I forgot to mention that. I don't. Let me see if there's like a boo sound or something for trending down. I don't even know how this sounds in the microphone. So, let's see. Boo sound effect. Let's see. All right. Well, my trending down players for 2024-2025 were Tristan Jarry and Chris Letang.
With lots of vehicles.
Nope, that is an ad.
And lots of freedom.
We'll get to the boos in just a second here. All right. Okay. Well, however that sounded to you, sorry about the ad that got sprinkled in before that. YouTube. Anyway, so trending down. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because, I mean, I think this was pretty evident from the eye test. Now, Tristan Jarry is the obvious candidate here because, I mean, it's not like Jarry had, spectacular season last year. He didn't. I'm not sure that I saw this drastic of a fall off coming. Now, to his credit, he did play a lot better in the latter half of the season, or the latter part of the season, rather, after his, after he was waived. He was optioned back to Wilkes-Barre Scranton after he went unclaimed. Bloomquist came up for a spell. Once Bloomquist was struggling a little bit at the NHL level in his second stint, they brought back up Jarry and made that switch. And since that switch, Jarry was pretty good in that final stretch. But just in a general sense, I mean, you think about the way that the season started off for Tristan Jarry. Out of training camp, Nedeljkovic had an injury that kept him out for, a handful of games. So Bloomquist and Jarry start the year on the roster. Bloomquist simply outplays him at the beginning of the season. And there was a point, if you remember correctly, that when Nedeljkovic came back, Bloomquist was playing so well at that point that they decided to keep 3 goaltenders. So they carried 3 goaltenders for a good while. And then, Yoel Bloomquist had a little bit of a shaky outing. Well, a lot of a shaky outing against the Dallas Stars on November 11th. Sure, you remember that one. 6 goals in the first period. Only 3 of those were from Bloomquist. The rest were from Jarry, but still. So after that game, Bloomquist was sent back down to the AHL level. They ran Jarry and Nedeljkovic again for a little bit. Failed experiment. Jarry didn't show much improvement. Eventually leads to him getting waived. Bloomquist back up, like I said, and then, I already explained the rest of it, but, an 893 save percentage this year, which let me tell you, a few weeks ago, that looked a lot worse. 312 goals against average, a 16, 12, and 6 record, which is actually better than I thought it was, but basically in every sense of the word, this season couldn't have gone much worse for Jarry, and especially with goaltending prospects knocking at the door. Bloomquist. Everybody should have heard Sergei Murashov's name by now. Taylor Gauthier just had a shutout in Wilkes-Barre Scranton for their last regular season game. Philip Larson played well most of the season for Wilkes-Barre Scranton until falling off late. He did have an injury that kind of set him back. So, the NHL guys are well aware that there are guys on their heels for those starting positions. I am very curious to see what happens this summer with the Penguins goaltending situation. Something's got to give. Sergei Murashov cannot be starting ECHL games next season. You can't carry 3 goaltenders in Wilkes-Barre Scranton at the AHL level and expect them to be able to develop the way that they're supposed to develop. That's simply not enough games for 3 guys. somebody's got to go this offseason, whether that's Jari or Nedeljkovic, in order to make sure those other guys are on the right development track. Because Joel Blomqvist should be at the NHL level next season, I presume. Let him work that out. But anyway, Tristan Jarry trending down most of the year. And then this one's a little bit tougher for me because, as I'm sure you've heard by now, Chris Letang did miss the final game of the regular season. He had a successful surgery to close a small hole in his heart. And I mean, this is something before, I saw people already freaking out about it, but before people freak out, I guess, this is a relatively common procedure. I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to speak on the medical side of it. I'm not qualified to do that. But the way that Mike Sullivan explained it is just, this is something that, the medical staff has been talking to him about this all year. This is something that has been planned for a really long time. Sullivan basically just said, since Letang was a little bit beaten up, bruised at the end of the season anyway, he was dealing with a couple, minor injuries. They just decided it was a good time to get it done. But I don't know if you remember correctly, but Chris Letang has had this issue for a long time. I think they discovered it, after his first stroke. So this is something, he's been dealing with this for about a decade. And, again, can't speak on the medical validity of this, but based on what I've read and just, a little research I've done on the topic, it does seem like, this procedure is supposed to help prevent stroke. So obviously, best wishes to Letang for a speedy recovery. They said the recovery is 4 to 6 weeks. I wouldn't panic as this being something career ending. I can't speak for Chris Letang. Anything with your heart is scary. Anything dealing with stroke is scary, but we know the history that Chris Letang has had, but it seems like this was something that was in the works for a while, and the team doesn't seem overly concerned about it. So unless you hear anything different, I wouldn't be. So, but anyway, this is a tough one for me because Chris Letang has been a very good player for a very long time for the Pittsburgh Penguins. It's been him, Sid, and Gino for 19 years. Never has that been done before in professional sports where 3 guys play together that long or teammates that long. It just does not happen. And it's not like it was all nostalgia that kept these guys together. Like, let's just remember that these were really good hockey players, and they still are. They wouldn't have been kept around if they weren't. So it's unfortunate to say that I think this is the first season I think there was a tangible decline in Chris Letang's game. First of all, on the offensive side of things, he only had 9 goals and 30 points this season, which is, well below his career averages. In fact, that is the lowest total since 2013-2014 when he had 22 points. That was only in 37 games. That's the season that he had his first stroke. So really, you got to go back to 2009-2010 when he had 3 goals and 27 points. So this was his least productive season since then. But it's not even really the production that's, the concerning part. He was a minus 15 this season. One of the hallmarks of Letang's game that we've seen over the years is his skating. And I think he's lost a step. He wasn't able to get back on a lot of plays and kind of atone for some of those high risk plays that he makes that end in turnovers or mistakes. Not able to get back like he used to, not able to defend one-on-one like he used to be able to do. aside from the offensive game, because I forgot to mention this earlier. I mentioned there were career highs from the Washington game. Raquel, Rust. But Matt Grzelcyk also hit the 40-point plateau for the first time in his career with 2 assists that game. Matt Grzelcyk had 40 points this year. Krsletang had 30. And when you think of, your offensive defensemen on this team, the guys that are supposed to be driving the bus on offense, you think of Erik Karlsson and Krsletang. And simply put, Krsletang just isn't driving offense like he used to. And I personally think that he's getting too many minutes. I think this offseason is going to be kind of a telling one for where the Penguins feel like their defensive situation is. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of rumors about Erik Karlsson, understandably so. But another thing to consider here is I'm not sure that the Penguins don't realize that Letang just might not be a top pairing defenseman anymore. And I'm just going to go ahead and say it. He isn't. It's not his fault. He's aging. He's 38. He's not getting any younger. Not everybody ages like Sidney Crosby. But I think it might be time for the Penguins to either give Brunick, that 9-game trial next year, see what he can do, or look to maybe offset that and get somebody else, whether that's the RFA market, offer sheets. Not really any good unrestricted free agent defensemen, but you can look to the trade market. I think they really need to start thinking about revamping this blue line and not having it revolve around Chris Letang. It's sad to say, but I just think that's where he's at, and I think that's where the Penguins are at. They need to start getting younger on that blue line. So unfortunately, a trending down season for Chris Letang. And I think, with less minutes and a more sheltered role next season, maybe on a second pairing, Letang will be fine. He just can't play or be given the minutes that he was given this season. All right, so that's trending up, trending down. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about Locker Cleanout Day. We are at 57 minutes. I'm going to try to keep this to about 10 minutes. But there was a lot of, interesting little nuggets from Penguins Locker Cleanout Day, which was Friday. And, there was some talk of worlds. It seems like, Crosby, Sid and Erik Karlsson are considering the IIHF World Championship is in Sweden and Denmark this season. So it'll be right in Erik Karlsson's backyard. But he kind of said that he has to see how everything goes. He was dealing with a few, injuries throughout the season. He wants to see how his body feels and just like where he's at. Because his priority, he said, is getting back to the level that he wants to be at. And he doesn't feel like he's reached that level in the past couple of years. So, he said that's his priority. If the World Championship is a part of that, great. And that'd make him really happy. But that's something he has to assess. And then as far as Sid, he's already had a conversation with Kyle Dubas. Basically said that he's going to think about it and he'll let him know as soon as possible. Kind of the same kind of thing. I think he's kind of weighing rest versus keep going. He actually cited the Four Nations tournament, which we saw what happened with Sid after the Four Nations tournament. He just became the best player in the league. But, I would understand entirely if Sidney Crosby decides to take a little bit of a break. The man's earned it. Let's be real. But anyway, so Raquel won't be representing Sweden. Brian Russ won't be representing Team USA because they're both expecting babies at the beginning of May. So congrats to both of them. Same with Tristan Jarry. His wife's due date was actually on Friday this past week. So haven't heard any news on that front. But anyway, probably same situation with him with Team Canada. He said he hadn't heard anything or hadn't gotten the call yet, but I would assume that it's probably going to be a similar situation. Alex Nedeljkovic, Matt Grzelcyk, both would represent Team USA, said they're open to it. So we'll see if there's any Penguins playing at the World Championship this season. But that wasn't really the big topic of discussion. A lot of people were, Raquel, Rust reiterated their desire to stay in Pittsburgh. No shock there. Rust no movement clause expires this offseason. And obviously there's been a lot of trade talk around Rickard Rakell. They both want to stay here. They don't want to move. They reiterated that. Erik Karlsson also said he wants it to work here, but he also expressed the frustration in falling short for 2 years. And he acknowledges that he thinks they can get more out of this group. We talked about this. It's going to be interesting to see how the Penguins approach the Karlsson situation this summer. But I think the most interesting thing to come out of Locker Cleanout Day were just some of the Penguins players and coaches alike words about just how much confidence they have that this team can get things turned around quickly. And kind of on the fly, akin to the Capitals, akin to the Kings, some of these other teams that have, in one way or another, managed to execute a rebuild on the fly. And a couple of them had some pretty interesting things to say about it. And I'll read Brian Rust's quote first, because I did really like Brian Rust's quote on this. There's a very large sentiment in the room that this is not going to take as long as a lot of people think that it will. And these players really do believe in this group. So this is what Russ said. He said, obviously, we've got some good, solid young players, and you guys have all seen that. The people around this organization, they care so much, and they are so invested in making this team great again that I have no doubt this thing's going to be turned around quickly. Really strong words from Brian Rust there. Raquel kind of echoed a similar sentiment. He talked about the young guys, saying that, those guys came in here, they were productive and helped us win hockey games right from the start. So I think they got these games under the belt and they have the summer to prepare for next year. I think we're only going to get better with them. Erik Karlsson also had some things to say. He said, obviously, I think everyone here would love for that to happen, meaning, the quick turnaround akin to the Capitals, Kings, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure that in some regards, I think that's what they're hoping for, and that's what Kyle Dubas is trying to do. Whether it works out or not, you never know, but I like this team here. I think that the 2 years I've been here, we've underachieved, and the group that we have in here is capable of a lot more. So all of this was kind of an overwhelming sentiment with the players that, this jolt of youth that they had at the end of the season with Rutger McGroarty and Ville Koivunen, and then, later Vasily Ponomarev, Juna Koppanen, even Emil Benstrom to a certain extent. And then we had Valtteri Puustinen in those last couple games, I think these guys kind of got a sense of confidence from seeing these young players step into these roles and just belong. I think this jolt of youth at the end of the season gives them a sense of hope for optimism that this is going to turn around. Because, and I'm going to get into Mike Sullivan's quote in a second here, but, you think about the fact that they had 3 veterans with 30-plus goals on their roster this season. They had Evgeny Malkin that was still playing pretty well. I mean, aging out, yes, but largely without wingers for most of the season. And the best he looked this season was arguably this last stretch of games when he had Rickard Rakell and he had a young winger for a lot of that stretch, and Ville Koivunen, They have some veteran talent in place already that is good enough to, and under contract long enough to really help this team. And then when you marry that with the youth that's coming up through the system and the fact that Koivunen and McGroarty showed so quickly that their ability to adapt to the NHL level, adapt to NHL speed, and just fit right in, that has to be encouraging for these guys. And let me just read you what Sullivan said too, because I think this kind of might give a glimpse into what the thought process is. So he said, I think I asked him, about whether he believes that the Penguins have the right mix of veterans, talented veterans, and talented youth to try to execute this rebuild on the fly. And this is what he said. He said, I think we have the makings of being a competitive team. I think the team is postured right now to try to take that next step, and that next step towards becoming more competitive. It's not an easy process. Teams have deployed different strategies in how they go about that. I think Kyle's done a really good job in thinking through and strategizing with his hockey operations team on what he thinks is best for the Pittsburgh Penguins with the group that we have. Every organization is different, but I know that there's been a thorough process that the group has gone through when trying to strategize what the best course of action is for this group. And I believe that there's a core group here that's worthy of building around, and that's our challenge. That's the process that we're going through right now. Look, if you look at now, I hate to keep saying the Capitals because Sullivan acknowledged this, and he's acknowledged this a couple times, in his past couple press conferences. Nobody does this the same way. The way that Washington executed theirs isn't the same as the way LA executed theirs, isn't the same as the way the Rangers executed theirs before they fell off a cliff this season. No rebuild on the fly looks exactly the same. But I think something to maybe consider from the Capitals model. Now, granted, TJ Oshie, Nicholas Backstrom were on long-term IR. They're still very good players, and the Capitals would have loved to have them around. But that cap flexibility also allowed them to, go out and trade for guys like Jacob Chikrin, guys like Andrew Mangiapane, that helped them build this winner this season. But really, if you look at the Capitals, they're driven by this youth movement, by these younger guys, by these savvy trades and signings. They took on Pierre-Luc Dubois, they took on Dylan Strome. They took chances on some of these guys that either, needed a little bit of revival or change of scenery, some high upside there, but they needed, something different, or, just taking calculated risk on some of those guys. It's paid off. And you see those guys driving the bus. As good as Ovi's been this season, and he's been very, very good, I feel like a lot of their success has been driven by those younger guys, the McMichaels. We've seen the protests, McMichael, Strome, just like all these, they have the perfect collection of talent, I think, there. But something that they didn't do is draft top 10. This rebuild on the fly that we're talking about, the Capitals, started keeping their draft picks circa 2019. And they've largely kept them since then. But the only top 10 pick they had was Ryan Leonard in 2023. He went 8th overall. He didn't help the Capitals get to where they are this year. He's on the team now. He joined the team late. But he had no hand in the Capitals, winning the East this season. The thing about the Capitals is that they developed well. They drafted well. They scouted well. And they were able to, supplement this older core that they had with the right young players And then, fill in those gaps with those trades and those chances on guys like Pierre-Luc Dubois that worked out for them. And I think you're going to see a similar approach for the Penguins because, people like to say that the rebuild didn't start until the Jake Guentzel trade. In a sense, that might be true to an extent, but I kind of disagree. The Penguins started keeping picks, I'd say 2022. Obviously they traded that first rounder in 2023 for Erik Karlsson, which was a worthwhile gamble at the time. But they kind of recouped that that asset anyway, with getting Harrison Brunick the year after. And I know they didn't have a first round pick in 2023, but they still drafted well that year. We'll get to that in a second. Or no, they had Braden Yeager that year. I'm sorry. So yeah, it was a 2024. My years got mixed up, but they drafted Braden Yeager in 2023. They didn't have that first rounder in 2024. We went over the Harrison Brunick situation. Like 2022. So you go back to 2020. They drafted Joel Blomqvist that year. 2021 was Tristan Rose. Neither of those guys were first-round picks. They were second-round picks. Figure to be a part of the future, but not first-round picks. And then 2022, they draft Owen Pickering. They draft Sergei Murashov. 2023, you see them draft Braden Yeager, Emil Pianiniemi, a couple of these other guys that figure to be a part of that equation. And I'm just checking myself here. Mikhail Ilyin. Yeah, that's right. 2023. I knew I was forgetting somebody. So yeah, there's 3 impact players there. And obviously Yeager turned into Rucker McGroarty. Also drafted that year by the Jets. And then obviously 2024, you got Brunick, you got Howe, you got some potential shutdown defenseman options and Chase Pietola and Finn Harding. Who knows if they're going to make an impact at the NHL level. But the point here is I don't necessarily think that this strategy of building for the future started with the Guentzel trade. The Capitals started saving their draft capital in 2019. The Penguins started doing that in 2022. And they've largely done it since. So I'd argue that this goes back to 2022. But things were really set in motion with the Guentzel trade in terms of getting NHL-ready prospects and, talent that was on the verge to kind of fit that window that they wanted to fit into. So all that said, Sullivan talked earlier about, the draft capital and the draft cupboard for next season, this coming off season. And he talked about how Dubas is in a position to leverage some of that. I think he will. I just think with the collection of veterans that the Penguins have on their roster, with how well these veterans are still playing. They're still playing at a really high level, guys. You talk about Russ, you talk about Raquel, you talk about Crosby, Malkin. Ideally, you go get a second line center in the draft this season, or, in the RFA market or offer sheet market, trade market, what have you. We don't know what's going to happen with that Rangers first round pick yet, but they're going to try to build this thing back as soon as possible. And that's something that's been reiterated over and over again by Dubas. Now Sullivan's reiterating the same thing. Excuse me. Now the players are seeing the vision for that because of these young guys that have come up and made an impact so quickly. Whether people think it's the right move or not, if I were a betting person, I would bet that this team is not going to go into tank mode next season. Because look, realistically, even if the Penguins didn't try to be good, I don't think there's a world where they're bad enough to have a real shot at McKenna next season. Because those bottom teams in the West are putrid. And you think about Boston. I looked at that lineup sheet for that game against Boston, and granted, Boston beat the Penguins. But I had to second guess myself. It looked like an AHL lineup sheet. It was worse than the Penguins lineup sheet. There are going to be teams that will be aggressively tanking next season. Sidney Crosby is not going to let that happen. And that brings me to my very last point. I'm going to shut up after this. Look, I think this situation would be different. Now, I understand what people were saying that Crosby's 37. Yes, he is. Malkin is 38. Letang's 38. Yes, they are. Do I think Letang and Malkin are integral pieces of this puzzle at this point? Probably not. But Crosby is. And here's the thing. Building a team, building youth around Sidney Crosby, I don't think that would be for nostalgia. I don't think that would be for simply getting Sid one more run at the dance before he hangs up the skates. No. They're going to do this because Sidney Crosby is still a damn good hockey player. Sidney Crosby, I said it before, isn't like any other player in NHL history. Father Time has not fought a guy like Sidney Crosby before. Maybe, Tom Brady and LeBron James, other sports. There's a couple examples you can name out there, and they're true all-time greats. But even if you look at nobody's aged as gracefully as Sidney Crosby has. And that's why that question that Brian Russ posed, does Sid age? I don't know. Do you know? It sure doesn't seem like it. If he's playing like he's 27, treat it like he's 27. There's no reason not to. The fact of the matter is that Sidney Crosby is still a player worth building a team around. If he was showing signs that he wasn't that guy anymore, that would be not doing that. And he's working, but there I am. Sorry, I disappeared there for a couple seconds. But the point is, if management didn't think that Sidney Crosby was a player still worth building a team around, they wouldn't be doing this. Because that's the sentiment, and that's the reality. Sidney Crosby could very realistically play at this level for 2-3 more years. And then, what happens after that? You consider guys like Vila Koivunen and like Rutger McGroarty, whoever they're going to draft this season. There's some good players in the draft. Whoever they're going to draft next season. By the time Crosby retires, they'll have this collection of youth on the NHL roster. So that, in those couple transitional years, once Crosby hangs up the skates, that rebuild period doesn't have to be as long because they'll already have all these complementary pieces. They'll only need to bottom out for maybe a year or two, to get that other generational talent. Or, the cap's going up. They could acquire that talent in a different manner because there's going to be a lot of cap falling off once the veterans retire. You can speculate to the moon and back about what this team is going to look like 5 years down the road. Maybe Sidney Crosby is still playing. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's still playing like he's 27. Maybe he's not. But if there is anything that any hockey mind should have learned over the last 2 decades is that you don't question Sidney Crosby ever. If he's playing like he's 27, treat him like he's 27. He's still a guy worth building a team around. This has nothing to do with nostalgia. This is everything to do with talent. Sidney Crosby is still a top 10 player in the league. He figures to be a top 10 or 15 player in the league for, the next several years. Use that. They have some promising youth. They have the draft capital. There's no reason that they need to bottom out at this point. Even if there's a guy like Gavin McKenna there next year, again, there are going to be teams that are way more equipped to try a lot harder to tank than the Penguins. That's just reality. So that's my take on it. I'm curious to see what Kyle Dubas says on Monday in his, season-ending meeting with the media. I imagine it'll probably echo a lot of what he's already said and a lot of what Mike Sullivan said on Friday, but we'll see. This is going to be an interesting summer nonetheless for the Pittsburgh Penguins. I think there's going to be a lot of movement, maybe a couple surprises. We'll see. But that'll wrap it up today. I kept you long. What can I say? I couldn't help myself. There was a lot to talk about today. Probably talked a little too long about personal anecdotes at the beginning, but haven't really done that on here yet. So wanted to give my women in sports journalism out there a little bit of a boost. But just as a reminder, Pucks and Nat, you can find us on X at Pucks_Nat_pod, at Blue Sky. Same thing without the underscores. As for me, I'm Kelsey Sermetz of the Hockey News. I am the site editor and the team reporter for the Pittsburgh Penguins site on the Hockey News. You can find stories there daily from me. I'm going to be working on some draft profiles for, realistic potential draft targets for the Penguins for the positioning they're in as of now, as well as, writing up some of the stuff that we got from Locker Cleanout Day. We'll be following Wilkes-Barre Scranton pretty closely, as well as Wheeling. So stay tuned to the Hockey News Penguins website. And as for Pucks and Nat, thank you for a great first season, guys. Thank you for sticking it out with us through all the bugs, through all the technological glitches, through all the changes, through all the rotating carousel of people in and out. I appreciate you from the bottom of my heart. I know Hannah appreciates you guys from the bottom of her heart too. But like I said, give us feedback. Let us know what you'd like to see in season 2. I do want to stress that season 2 isn't starting next season. I will be having podcasts throughout the summer. I'm still working out whether or not that's going to be a weekly thing or maybe an every other week thing, at least until, the draft and free agency. So stay glued to Pucks and Nat socials. I'll keep you guys updated. I'm going to try to get this out weekly, but we'll kind of see what happens on that front. So that's going to wrap it up for now. Thanks again for listening. I appreciate you guys. And as usual, stay out of trouble in that.